For my presentation, I'm going to be talking about the effects of Eurocentric curriculum on Native American students' cultural identity. So just kind of a brief synopsis of what we're going to be going over. There will be an overview, the target challenges that are faced by this community, the community agencies that can directly help combat these target challenges, considerations for counselors when working with Native American students directly impacted by the effects of Eurocentric curriculum, intervention and assessment strategies, a conclusion, as well as a page of references. So to get into the overview, the purpose of this presentation is to create a deeper understanding in school counselors of the negative impacts that Eurocentric teaching has on Native American students, and to also provide us with techniques to help better support this population of youth. So two questions that are going to be looked at and addressed throughout this presentation are: in what ways are students notably disadvantaged to overcome the setbacks imposed by the challenge of Eurocentric curriculum? And also, how might they be underserved or under-resourced in navigating this challenge? These two questions are going to be looked at and identified so that counselors going forward can better address these challenges that Native American youth are facing. So, Native American youth have been systematically underserved in the traditional American schooling system since they ever began it. We started with forced assimilation into the Eurocentric lifestyle, and we have continued to erase and rewrite their history. Some rates just to look at that we're going to go over more on just the impacts right away that we can see for Native American students. So 95% of Native American students attend the public schooling system. That means only 5% are attending a school on a reservation or one that's specifically run by Native American corporations. With 95% enrolled in public schools, less than 50% of those students end up graduating high school. And in the past 20 years, there has been an 1,000% increase in suicide rates in Native American students. The U.S. Government Accountability Office said this quote, and I thought it was very impactful: American Indian and Alaska Native communities are looking for high-quality educational opportunities that also reflect their languages and cultures. This means it's not just important that we're providing them with the same educational opportunities that their peers are getting, but that they are also seeing themselves represented in the curriculum and teaching methods that are presented to them. So the target challenges that face these youth, there's 4 challenges that we're going to specifically look at today. Academic achievement. So this involves dropout rates as well as academic proficiency. So where are Native Americans performing in contrast to their peers? Loss of identity, which often can be seen through a lack of cultural representation. Feelings of self-worth. So we're going to look how that has to do with rates of suicide, depression, and substance abuse, as well as a mistrust in the schooling system. And what does this mistrust in the schooling system lead to for Native American students? So the first thing that we're looking at is those academic achievement rates, which I said that we would get back to. So as we said, less than 50% of Native American students graduate high school. So a study was taken in the 12 states with the largest population of Native American students. And while graduation rate among their peers was 71.5%, they had fewer than 50% of Native American students graduate. Some other statistics that go along with that is that a dropout rate of 60% is seen in Native American students. So from when they begin kindergarten or wherever they start in their school career with the public schooling system to when they graduate, we lose them somewhere along the way. And part of this is because of the impact that our curriculum and teaching methods have on them. Studies have also found that not only do Native Americans have a higher dropout rate, but they are also performing 2 to 3 grade levels below their white peers in math and reading. So in 2 fundamental categories of schooling, they are performing well below the grade level average, which means the way that they are being taught is not leading to acquisition of information. Lastly, for Native American students who do graduate high school, only 24% of those students end up enrolling in college programs. Often, this has to do with the fact that resources are not provided to Native American students to find funding, to get loans, grants. Native American students can often be first generation going to college. And so, as counselors, we have to look at how do we make sure these Native American students are getting the information they need to go beyond high school into college. Next, we have a loss of identity that happens with Native American students. So a loss of identity means that they don't really truly know where they fit in with their culture and with the Eurocentric culture that they're a part of. So what we've seen is a lack of representation of Native American students and their culture because of the curriculum that we use. So our curriculum works to misrepresent, hide, and erase the history of Native American students. What we know about Native American students is that personal narratives passed down through Native American families contain generations of history comprised of memories of shared historical events, cultural traditions, and the triumphs and hardships that they've faced together. These reconstructed narratives describe lived experience become the foundation of a collective as well as their individual identity. So, what happens is when you take this cultural identity that they have and bring it into the schooling system, they lose that part of their identity. So, Brayboy and McCarty in 2015 found in a study that schools served, and this is a quote, as homogenizing institutions by focusing on creating a model United States citizen and enforcing a staunch commitment to individualism at the expense of native languages and identities. So, what happens is we have a clear erasure of who they are fundamentally when they come into the schooling system. So, they have to take what they know about themselves, try to place it into what the schooling system says about them, and they lose their identity in the whole of the community. So feelings of self-worth directly relate into this. So some of the startling statistics that we have about how self-worth is impacting Native American students is, as I said, that really intense statistic that suicide rates have increased 1,000% over the past 20 years for Native American students. They have an arrest rate that is 10 times higher than their white peers and 3 times higher than their African American peers. Lastly, Native American substance abuse is double the national average of any other culture. So, what we see is that Native Americans are experiencing some level of depression, anxiety, loss of self that's leading to these increased rates of very bad things, very bad statistics. Numerous studies have found that self-esteem or self-worth is directly correlated to higher academic achievement, decreased levels of depression and suicidal ideation, as well as greater levels of confidence. So the lower your self-worth, the higher those other rates of depression, of suicidal ideation are going to be, and the lower your academic achievement is going to be. What we can tell about self-worth or self-concept, especially in the K through 12 levels, is that the self concept or self worth is directly correlated to a feeling of belonging or identifying within a community or a social group. Because Native American students don't feel represented, and as we talked about before, feel a loss of identity within the schooling system, they often have lower feelings of self-worth. Lastly, there's a mistrust in schooling systems. So this quote is from studies conducted by Thomason in 2012, and they found that although as a group, Native Americans experience depression, anxiety, and other psychological disorders at a higher rate than the general population, they underutilize mental health services. And this comes with mistrust of professionals in the school system because of the way Native Americans have been treated. And so we see Native American students not seeking out counseling for the help that they need. So we're going to look at some community agencies that can help with some of these problems that have been identified. So we have the National Indian Education Association. They work to train teachers, to create new programming, to allocate funding, all of which help support better cultural, traditional Native American curriculum in the schooling system. The Native American Art Council works to incorporate traditional Native American art practices into counseling to help students with art-based therapy. We have the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, which works on providing as well curriculum that is based in Native American traditions, and the American Indian College Fund, which works to provide students who want to go into higher education with loans, grants, and funding to do so. So some considerations for counselors when working with Native American students. Counselors should anticipate some level of resentment, aggression, or distrust from the student because of the history of oppression and erasure that has happened throughout their culture. So when working with Native American students, you need to be able to separate yourself from the fact that they are coming in with a level of distrust and work to build that trust. Native practices, methods, and techniques can look like talking circles, purification ceremonies, art therapy like painting, beading, weaving, clay making, pottery, and play therapy. So it is important to note that with Native American students, they often will not like to be directly asked questions in counseling. They're used to a group mentality in their culture, and that's the way that they also like to be counseled. So a study that I thought was important to consider when thinking about how to incorporate Native American cultures is that when asked whether or not it was important to incorporate spirituality into counseling, 55% of Native Americans said that they did find that important. However, when asked if non-Native counselors should use Native health practices such as talking circles, purification ceremonies, etc., 60% of respondents said that this would be inappropriate and could seem patronizing or harmful. So as counselors, we have to work on incorporating those through the tribe and not just on our own. So some counseling practices that counselors can use when working with Native American students. Moving counseling sessions to an environment outside of the office. Native American culture is very big on being in touch with nature, being in touch with the outside, and oftentimes the counseling environment that we have may feel confining or just beyond what is comfortable for them. Permit drop-ins. Native Americans may not want to make the appointment, they may just want to drop in, and that needs to be something that you're okay with. And paying attention to particular nonverbal cues. As I said, Native Americans typically don't like to be asked direct forward questions, and so being able to read what their body is telling you is very important. To add on to my point, Native Americans often resent the situational demand of self-disclosure and perceive the counselor's questions as intrusive or inappropriate. So this is why things like art-based therapy and play-based therapy allow the student to express themselves without directly having to converse. So using techniques such as silence is in a positive manner, implementing restatement of what the student is saying rather than asking questions, and also admitting ignorance when not understanding something integral about the student's culture. So saying that you're not aware and opening that boundary with them and letting them discuss their culture with you can really build some of those bonds that may not be there to begin with. So some intervention and assessment strategies that can be used. Demer in 2001 found that Native language and cultural programs and students' identification with such programs are associated with improved academic performance, decreased dropout rates, improved school attendance, decreased clinical symptoms, and increased personal behavior. So plans that incorporate their language and cultural identity improve all of the things that we've touched on as being a negative effect that curriculum has on Native American students. So some intervention programs that counselors can try to incorporate in their schools would be bilingual or immersion programs. So working on bringing the Native American language of the tribes near you into the school. Native language and cultural revitalization programs, incorporating local knowledge and culture into the top curriculum. So we know that there are many Native tribes, so you need to look into the tribes of your area. Culturally based after school programming, so safe spaces for Native American students to go that incorporate the traditions and cultures of their tribes. Increase community outreach. As a counselor, it's important that you are talking to the tribes around you, finding out their traditions and beliefs and how you can incorporate those in a culturally sensitive way. Receiving training on Native cultural competencies. And we should also be extra monitoring Native American students for underachievement and the underlying cause of it. So as counselors, we are asked to look at our school community and how are the Native American students being impacted and why. Providing curriculum and groups to Native American students that focus on ideas such as resiliency, self-perception, and cultural identity. So as I addressed, self-worth and cultural loss are a big issue that impacts Native American students, and providing counseling courses that are aimed specifically at improving those areas of mental health are very important for Native American students. A brief conclusion. We have seen that the systematic erasure of the Native American identity leads to serious problems in the K through 12 schooling system, emotionally, mentally, socially, and academically. If we can incorporate the things that have been discussed into the school system, we can improve not only students' lives, but their identity within our community. And lastly, the references. I hope you enjoyed and learned something. Please feel free to ask any questions that have come up during my presentation. Thank you.